Great. Well, I'm going to go ahead and get started as I have a little brief intro to give. Thank you again for joining us. My name is Joshua Stickney. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm the Director of Communication at the Asian Law Caucus. I'll be moderating today's briefing, but I'm excited to pass it to the legal and community experts we have. We're so grateful to ReThink Media for hosting and to AAPI New Jersey and the South Asian American Justice Collaborative for partnering on this timely conversation, as well as to my colleagues at the Asian Law Caucus. And thank you to all of you for covering this moment with the seriousness and accuracy that it demands. So next week on April 1st, the Supreme Court will hear oral arguments in Trump versus Barbara, a case that goes to the core of the American democracy and asks a fundamental question of who gets to be an American. For more than 100 years, this answer has been clear and settled. The 14th Amendment guarantees that if you are born in the United States, you are a citizen, with very few exceptions. Not because of politics, not because of who your parents are, but because the Constitution says so. Trump's executive order attempts to undo that guarantee, something that no president has the authority to do on their own. And while the immediate impact would fall on immigrant families, we need to be clear that the consequences would extend much further. It would fundamentally change how citizenship is recognized and verified in this country, turning what has long been automatic into something conditional, bureaucratic, and uncertain for all families. This is also a story about communities, particularly Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander communities, who have long been at the center of defining and defending these constitutional protections. From the United States versus Wong Kim Ark, which affirmed birthright citizenship as we know it today, to Wickwoo versus Hopkins, which established equal protection regardless of citizenship status, to Fred Korematsu's challenge to Japanese American incarceration. AAPI communities have helped shape the meaning of the 14th Amendment through both struggle and advocacy. And that history matters in this moment. So today's briefing is designed to help ground coverage of this case in both its legal stakes and its real world impact, particularly for the communities who would be most and first impacted and for the broader democratic principles at stake. You'll hear from our legal and community leaders who are working at the intersection of litigation, policy, and organizing to defend that promise. Here's how today's briefing will run. I will introduce each of our speakers, and we will reshare names, titles, and organizations in the chat for attribution purposes. Next, each speaker will give 2 to 3 minute introductory remarks. Then I'll pose 2 to 3 questions for our panel to discuss. And then finally, we will open the mic to press who have submitted questions in the Q&A function, which we encourage you to use throughout the panel discussion. I will ask reporters to come off mute, introduce themselves, their outlets, and pose their questions to either specific panelists or the panel as a whole. And then we will close by following up with any materials referenced in the briefings. On to our speakers. First is Winnie Kao, Senior Counsel for Impact Litigation at the Asian Law Caucus. Winnie is attorney of record on the Barbara case and will be in Washington, D.C. next week for oral arguments. Next is Anisa Rahim, Legal Director at South Asian American Justice Collaborative, or SAJCO. SAJCO submitted an amicus brief on behalf of the respondents. And our final panelist is Rosalind Shao, Co-Executive Director at AAPI New Jersey, a signatory on an amicus brief on behalf of the respondents. Now, I welcome Winnie to come off mute and begin with your opening remarks.
Thanks, Josh, and welcome to those attending. Excited to be here. I just wanted to give a little bit of kind of context and legal background before turning it over to Anisa and Rosalind. So just to orient us, Barbara is a nationwide class action case that ALC filed with the ACLU, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, the State Democracy Defenders Fund, to strike down the Trump administration's executive order on birthright citizenship. Birthright citizenship is this idea, this really powerful idea, that if you're born in this country, you belong, and you start as a full member of this democracy, regardless of your parents' status or circumstances. And it's the rule that really has allowed and inspired generations of Americans to invest, contribute, and make this country what it is today. Trump's executive order seeks to prospectively strip birthright citizenship from children who, though born in the U.S., lack a parent who is either a U.S. citizen or has permanent legal status at the time of the child's birth. And the reach of the executive order is exceedingly broad. It targets not just babies whose parents are undocumented, but babies born to folks who are here legally on work visas, student visas, asylum seekers, DACA recipients, and others. The question before the court is whether this executive order is lawful. And in many ways, it's really hard to think of a stronger legal case. The executive order is contrary to the text and history of the Citizenship Clause of the 14th Amendment and the common law on which it's based. The holding in the landmark Supreme Court case Wong Kim Ark and subsequent Supreme Court cases. And it also independently violates a federal statute that codifies birthright citizenship. All the lower courts to examine the executive order so far have agreed that it's unlawful. This administration is nonetheless arguing that somehow this country has gotten it wrong for more than 100 years, and that the contested subject to the jurisdiction of language that's in the Citizenship Clause of the 14th Amendment somehow carries an unspoken requirement that parents of the baby be domiciled in the US at the time of the baby's birth, and that you can't be domiciled in the US or completely subject to its jurisdiction if you're only in this country temporarily, or if you're here in the US without legal authorization. We think the administration is clearly wrong. The Citizenship Clause of the 14th Amendment doesn't say anything about parental domicile. It focuses on the child, not the parent. And the administration's arguments have also already been considered and rejected by the court in that seminal birthright citizenship case, Wong Kim Ark. Again, that case was brought by a Chinese American who was born in 1873 in San Francisco, actually just blocks away from our ALC office, to parents who were Chinese nationals, because at the time, the US government didn't allow Chinese immigrants to naturalize. After visiting his parents in China, he was detained upon trying to re-enter the US because of the Chinese Exclusion Act. And he argued that he should be granted re-entry because he is a US citizen by birth under the 14th Amendment. And the court agreed. And in the 120 plus years since, the decision has been understood to affirm that US-born children are citizens, regardless of the parents' immigration status. All three branches of government, Republican and Democratic, have relied upon that understanding since. What this administration is proposing is a radical departure from that tradition, from established law, and will only sow confusion, upheaval, and more problems. The repercussions, which Anissa and Roslyn will talk about more, are really hard to overstate. This executive order would strip thousands of US-born children of their rights as US citizens, permanently marginalize them from our democracy, and leave them vulnerable to immigration enforcement. In addition, if the court upholds the government's theories, the citizenship of other Americans could be called into question. Vast swaths of US law would need to be re-examined because they are premised on birthright citizenship. And it will also be a total administrative and bureaucratic nightmare for everyone, even for parents who are US citizens. If government entities have to build new systems to verify a baby's citizenship by first checking the parent's domicile and status. The framers enshrine birthright citizenship in the Constitution to protect it from the whim of a single president or a political moment. And it's really important that the public know what's at stake. So thank you for covering this important issue and fight. I'll turn it to Anissa.
Thanks so much, Winnie.
Hey, thank you. Yeah, thank you for the opportunity to speak and for those who are attending this press conference. As Winnie shared, we're here representing SACHCO, which is a new national civil rights nonprofit on behalf of South Asians in the diaspora. And we felt very strongly to file an amicus brief here together with Davis Wright Tremaine to share our concerns. And we were joined with 30 plus signatories across the country who also felt the same way. So to follow up on some of what we didn't want to duplicate any of the arguments, obviously, but we really wanted to do was show how does this affect South Asians specifically. And we found that the order, it would destabilize families, it would deter talented individuals from migrating to the United States, it would harm vital sectors of the US economy, and it would risk statelessness for US-born individuals and increase administrative burden. And so our brief linked a lot of these disastrous effects with historical context, and we began with South Asian migration, which dates back to the 17th century. We were looking at documents that showed that you have South Asian seamen who sought legal redress as far back as the 17th century for violations of contract. You have an Afghan who fought in the American Civil War and left behind a 200-page history documenting his experiences, and that this migration only increased and diversified in the 19th century, and that you have South Asians who were living among African Americans, Puerto Ricans, Creole neighborhoods, and in some cases forming very vibrant mixed communities such as Punjabi Mexicans. And so, similar to the current moment, the increase in South Asian migration and labor had led to racial animus, which then led to discriminatory laws that barred immigrants in broad ways. And then you have the Supreme Court case of United States versus Thind, which reflects that animus, finding that Thind, who was an immigrant from Punjab, India, and also a sergeant in the U.S. Army during World War I, was considered not white and therefore not eligible for citizenship. This then led to a subsequent denaturalization campaign of 50 South Asian U.S. citizens, most of whom had been here for more than 5 years, and that includes even Thind's own South Asian lawyer. And so, similar to Dred Scott, this case law and reasoning should also be considered shameful. So, while the administration is characterizing immigrants as temporary, the reality and the facts are quite different. South Asians are heavily represented among families who are waiting for decades in employment-based and family-sponsored immigrant categories. And due to the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, which really reformed immigration law to a large extent at that time, you have over 6 million South Asians in the US as compared to the 12,000 that were there in 1960. But you also have a lot of backlogs and delays under current immigration laws and quotas that disproportionately affect certain groups. So, for example, Indians represent 63% of that backlog. You have Indians, Pakistanis, and Bangladeshis who are among the top 3 of those top 10 countries on these long waiting lists. And under current processing times, there's a projected almost less than 400,000 Indians who are likely to die without ever receiving their green card. So as a result, you have many babies who are born to parents who are here completely lawfully, but don't have lawful permanent residence simply because of the backlog and are waiting. And this order targets those very babies. And that contrary to claims of birth tourism, this is a population that's based in the US, that's long-term, that pays taxes, that works and contributes to their local communities. And so a really important point that we emphasized in our brief was that there's just a simple fact of a brain drain that will occur if this order ends up being implemented. And that includes, reflections that are going to happen in the tech industry where you'll have it affected the STEM workforce. It'll be reflected in healthcare and where there's a large number of South Asians who are represented across that industry, and we can talk more about that later. You have labor, service, and hospitality, where there's a large representation of South Asians who are owning businesses and who are also participating in those industries through the workforce and other spillover effects. And that with all of these contributions, you have huge trillions of dollars at stake, really, I think, if you think about the contribution of the economy and the jobs that are involved. So we looked at that, and then we also are looking very practically, look at all the people who would be excluded under this order if their parents were because their parents were not legal permanent residents at the time they were born. And examples include Kamala Harris, Bobby Jindal, Vivek Ramaswamy, Kal Penn, and so many others who would just not be here today if you had an order like this implemented. And our brief also raises questions of statelessness. Obviously there's going to be over 250,000 children who are born per year under this order may potentially not have status elsewhere. And so because of the sheer population, you'll have a lot of South Asians who will be affected. And that will be babies from countries like Nepal, Afghanistan, Bhutan, where there is not a clear pathway to citizenship in their home countries. So therefore, where do they belong? And finally, as was raised, this brief is obviously going to raise questions around administrative burden. It's going to be difficult for U.S. citizens to be able to obtain the kind of verification and the proof of immigration status, and then the spillover effects that will have on obtaining government benefits that are needed for children, such as CHIP, Medicaid, TANF, SNAP, and so forth. And just to conclude, I mean, I had spoken to a woman who recently was an H-1B holder, had recently given birth, and she just described the anxiety that she had in anticipation of the implementation of this order. And that also it's really changed the way that immigrants are thinking about whether or not they want to be in the US, because can they really be here in the long term and feel like that they're safe to be here. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Anissa. And for the folks who've joined us, just a reminder, as our panelists are speaking, to please submit questions for the Q&A at the end, utilizing the Q&A function. I will pass it over to Roslyn.
Hi, I'm Rosalind Shao. I'm the co-executive director with AAPI New Jersey, and we advocate for the 1 million Asian Americans in New Jersey. In addition to supporting our community by advocating for immigrant rights and legislation that strengthens our communities, an integral part of our work is education, because we believe that it is through education that we can get at the root of racism. For the last year, we've been training teachers and putting lesson plans about birthright citizenship directly into classrooms. We're facilitating conversations that connect this history to what students are living through right now. And we've taken this work to conferences from California to New York, Alabama to Illinois. Most people are surprised to learn the story of Wong Kim Ark, which illustrates how Asian Americans have been an integral part of our nation since its founding. In 1895, a cook named Wong Kim Ark was denied re-entry into his own country. He was born in San Francisco. He made his life here, but immigration officials argued that the Chinese Exclusion Act overrode the 14th Amendment, that his birth on American soil meant nothing, that he did not belong. The Chinese community rallied around him, raised funds, and hired attorneys to fight his case all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court that had just established separate but equal and paved the way for Jim Crow segregation in Plessy v. Ferguson. But in 1898, in the case of U.S. v. Wong Kim Ark, even this same court affirmed what the Constitution already said. If you are born here, you are an American. Most people don't know that Asian Americans were at the center of this fight, that Wong Kim Ark and communities and organizations like ours helped establish birthright citizenship as settled law. These are the rights being threatened by Trump's executive order. The families affected are not abstractions. They are our neighbors, our students, our communities. We are training our community and making sure people across New Jersey care about this issue, especially Asian Americans who have played such a pivotal role in affirming birthright citizenship, because these rights and protections belong to every one of us. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rosalind, and to all of our panelists. I'm now going to ask just two brief questions, just given time today. The first is, if this executive order is allowed to stand, what would the changes be for families across the country, regardless of background or immigration status, particularly in those first days after a child is born, and then also for our broader economy and institutions and infrastructure? And I open this to anyone on the panelists, but maybe Rosalind, would you like to begin?
There are so many changes that I think our community are just really not ready to face. I'm not even sure what the trickle-down effect would be, but what we're preparing for is this idea that our community members would be stateless, that there would be this underclass of people who live in our country that are extremely vulnerable to being not allowed in certain spaces, not allowed to have certain conversations, that it would be really difficult just to get through the day-to-day of everyday life. So these are the kinds of things that we're trying to educate our community about why they should care about birthright citizenship, and in a lot of ways, why they should care about rights that they've taken for granted for a long time.
Thank you, Rosalind. Lisa or Winnie?
Yeah, I would just echo what Anissa spoke a little bit about in her remarks of about the fear and confusion. I think if this executive order is allowed to stand, there will be a lot of clarity that will need to be given about how it's going to be implemented. How is it going to work? How how do you prove citizenship for your newborn when it's not based on a birth certificate anymore? How's the government going to inquire about the parent's domicile or the parent's status? Um, all of those rules that were so clear, you just show your birth certificate, all of that's going to go out the window for these new babies. And there's already so much fear and confusion. As Anissa mentioned, we also had parents have had parents calling us when the executive order came out, asking us really striking questions of like, should I induce and have my baby early while the executive order is still enjoined, so that I can better protect my baby? When the CASA decision came down, the Trump v. CASA decision that the Supreme Court heard last year that limited the initial nationwide injunctions on the executive order to just plaintiffs and states involved in the existing cases, we had parents asking if they should move and have their baby in a different state, a state that was part of these cases challenging the executive order. Parents calling us wondering if their baby is going to be subject to deportation, if they could get separated. What about, if they have a mixed status family, kids who are U.S. citizens and a baby who's not, and what will statelessness mean for my baby? It's just really crazy and really powerful and upsetting questions that parents are struggling with, and would obviously have to be even more fearful about if this executive order is allowed to stand.
Thank you, Winnie. I'm happy to move on to our next question, and I'm curious just how are AAPI communities reacting, organizing, responding in this moment?
I can jump in on this one. Besides all of our education work, we've really been trying to mobilize our community. Just last week, we hosted over 100 community members for a teach-in. It was at an event that we called My Dinner with Wong Kim Ark. So it was a community dinner as well, where we really went through the history of birthright citizenship and also tied it to Asian American histories overall. Over the past few months, we've also been gathering our community and inviting them to join our Asian Auntie Brigade to create art that we plan to bring to the April 1st rally at the Supreme Court. We've been practicing our drumming, our rally chants, and it's a moment that we're bringing community together to find joy in learning and practicing and just being together. Um, and we're really trying to make sure that they understand the history, understand what's at stake, and help them figure out what role they want to play in protecting our rights. And what we find is that when people understand what's at stake, that birthright citizenship is a part of our history, it makes them want to act. So we're trying to make sure that we're helping them find how they can take that next step and take an action.
Yeah, I'll follow up on that as well. I mean, I think we're seeing this also as a moment for organizing. I mean, I think in working on this brief and soliciting signatories, and many of them, whether it was South Asian Bar Association, whether it was like the South Asian, members who are part of the South Asian Coalition, which is a group of nonprofits, we found that has been itself a way to kind of educate, a lot of different people who may not normally be even tapped in completely to the discussions around birthright citizenship, whether they're, even lawyers themselves, much less community members. And so I think that that moment of just even having people sign on, feel like that they can have a voice in this process has been itself very powerful. And then we're also working to organize and be part of the rally next week on the 1st, and using that as like a moment where people really come out and also show their voice, and have developed some of our first merch, which is a t-shirt, South Asians for the 14th Amendment. And I think that these, I think there'll be just more to come depending on what happens. But, as much as like this is a dim time, I think it's also a time that we can sort of think about how do we band together and become closer in this time as well. And I will say, just as I was thinking earlier today, the South Asian Coalition had organized a South Asian Coalition briefing that was organized by Pramila Jayapal, and birthright citizenship was one of the things that we raised among many other issues. And I think that, again, it's a moment where people really feel like this goes so much to the heart of what their experiences have been. And she herself, Pramila Jayapal, expressed how she for years was on all kinds of visas and was not an LPR. And, and if you think about just all the people who are going to be affected by an order like this across the country, it's just really devastating. So, I think it's a time to sort of stand up, and I think communities are doing that and feeling that.
Thank you, Anissa. And for our non-legal reporters in the House, LPR is lawful permanent residence. I'm gonna ask one more question because I think it's important in this moment, and we have some time. For any of our panelists, what's one impact, story, or consequence of this fight that's being underreported right now? And why does it matter? And why should it be shared?
I guess I can just briefly go first and say, I I just think more coverage of it. It's kind of um, given the repercussions of an adverse ruling. It's just such a um, important case, and the consequences are so wide wide-reaching that I do think just coverage of it, and also the broad support for birthright citizenship. Anissa's team is just one brief, but we've had broad amicus support from a broad swath of states, localities, members of Congress, bar associations, interfaith groups, academics, civil rights, and community groups across the spectrum who recognize how important birthright citizenship is and how devastating it would be if the executive order were upheld.
I want to add that from a community member's perspective, it is really frightening to see all the attacks on the 14th Amendment in general. We're seeing everything happening with due process, with equal protection, and now with birthright citizenship. It feels like there's an overall attack on the 14th Amendment itself that I don't feel like I'm hearing that much about. And what does that mean for all of us?
Yeah, I think I would just add and follow up to that. I mean, we're doing a lot of work on other immigration policies and so forth, and sometimes I think there's a perception that those policies affect people who are maybe just undocumented or temporary and so forth. But there's a real intersectionality between all of these issues, and I think it really does come out with birthright citizenship in a way that I would like to, I agree. And then if you then have something that's constitutionally then overturned, it's really not just like this temporary thing, the way executive orders or guidances are. It would be just to have such far-reaching consequences. So I hope people really understand that within the context of even immigration, how both they're significant this is for everybody.
Thank you so much to our panelists today. We're now going to open the question and answers up to folks who've joined us. Thank you again for sticking with us today. As requested at the top of the hour, please utilize the Q&A function to submit your questions. I will prompt reporters to come off mute one by one to ask your questions. We will allow one follow-up question per reporter and ask that you state your name, outlet, location, and to whom your question is directed before you state your question. I will begin with Carlos at KQED and invite you to come off mic to ask your question. Which I believe my team is helping.
Okay, hi. Yes, sorry. The function to unmute took a little longer to activate. But thank you all so much for your time, for your insight. Like mentioned, my name is Carlos Cabral Melli. I'm a reporter at KQED, the NPR and PBS station in San Francisco. And my question, because my coverage has really been focused on informing parents that would be affected in this situation, families that would be affected in this situation, who are just dealing with so much misinformation or just, anxiety over the outcome. So, what advice would you have now for expecting parents in California? But if you can talk about, if you feel comfortable talking about nationally as well, that'd be great. That could be affected by a ruling in favor of the administration. So, what are some things that nervous parents can do now?
Thanks for the question. I can try to field it first. I mean, I guess I first just want to say that I'm hopeful about the outcome here. I mean, as I said before, it is such a strong legal case. It would be a radical departure from over 120 years of precedent and understanding, and this court still does care about its credibility. A departure would be really hard for the public to understand, and I think to accept. So I do want to say that. For families, I mean, some of what we have been saying is first we want them to try to stay healthy and safe. That if they haven't, they might think about consulting with an immigration attorney just to see if there are other legal options for the family or the baby around status. We don't expect a ruling until June or July, and even after that, even if this court were to radically depart from established law and uphold this executive order, it wouldn't. I think there'd be an implementation period, and that was true even with the CASA case when the court cut back on the nationwide injunction, limited it. It didn't do it right away. There was a grace period to prepare. So would imagine the same would be true here too. But for those who are having your baby now, get a passport immediately. Don't sit and wait. Try and get all the identification papers, identification numbers immediately. I guess that's some advice we would give.
Anissa, Rosalind, anything else? Looks like Taiki, also from KQED, your hand is raised. You're welcome to ask your question now.
Excellent. Hi, KQED in the house. I guess this is a question for Winnie, because my station is based in the Bay Area. You're based there in San Francisco, and the Wong Kim-Art case came out of San Francisco. I know this is a national issue and the implications are national, but can you say something about sort of the San Francisco or Bay Area roots or relevance of a case like this and California, really?
I think it's I do think the implications are really national, although I think that I have been really inspired by the way that people have been stepping forward to assert their rights. And even in the face of, such a retaliatory administration, folks have so much to lose in stepping forward in these cases and um, Wong Kim Ark and that story took incredible courage and says a lot about the community that supported him. And we all need to continue to be inspired by that example and those of our clients. And I certainly am every day. I guess the other kind of Bay Area connection that immediately came to my mind when you asked your question is Cecilia Wong, who is the ACLU legal director, will be arguing this case before the Supreme Court next Wednesday. And there is something just really poignant. Cecilia, who's from the Bay Area, who's Asian American, something really poignant about an Asian American woman defending Wong Kim Ark and birthright citizenship before the court. She's an amazing lawyer, an amazing advocate. We couldn't be in better hands. But I think folks will see on Wednesday how amazing she is. But yeah, I think I don't know if others have additional thoughts, but there are just so many, the immigrant rights community and the population here has been so active and brave and supportive. I think that we've led the way on so many issues, and that's been true here as well.
Just as it's interesting as you're bringing that question, because I had just met someone yesterday who was part of the Berkeley Radical History of South Asian Walking Tour, and one of the places they commemorate, or I guess there's a street in San Francisco after Bagai, the individual who was denaturalized and then later ended up committing suicide because he went from a successful businessman to someone who didn't have anything. And I just thought that that was such an important thing both to have as part of this Radical History Walking Tour, but also too, I don't know the ways that, and that too coming out of the Bay Area, and how, what kind of histories are important to like share and sort of that people do remember, this history and what it means. So just that's in terms of the Bay Area, what I learned.
Maybe one additional point that one of my colleagues is nudging me on is also just the breadth of this executive order. So, H-1Bs and people here on work visas. I mean, obviously there's a lot of folks in the Bay Area and Silicon Valley who are implicated by these immigration policies, maybe in a way that they haven't been in other attacks by this administration on immigrant communities. And so I think there's also that dynamic as well.
Thank you all for that thorough answer, and thank you for the question. Are there any other questions folks want to raise for our panelists today? All right, hearing none, really grateful for folks who came today. I'm just going to help us close. We'd like to let folks know that these spokespeople are available after for additional interviews. Both myself and others on the call will be at the Supreme Court on April 1st. If you're interested in coordinating an interview on location on the day of oral arguments, please contact us. My colleague Santi is going to put his email into the chat, and that is the best way to reach all the folks you've heard from today. Likewise, we will follow up with some materials, some of which you received ahead of this, others were mentioned today in the call. And please let us know if you have any other follow-up questions. Otherwise, thank you so much for joining us today. Again, we appreciate your coverage of this issue, and we look forward to chatting with more of you soon as this case progresses.